Hello, everyone. I'm Sam from the Next Web. I just wanted to give you all a very warm welcome to our first ever Sprint Couch Conference. No matter where you are viewing in the world, it's great to have you. And this is one of the beautiful things about doing online events recently, is that we can have you from wherever you are located. So that's great. Before I introduce the three speakers of this session to you all, I just want to go over two important rules of thumb for you. So the first being is that if you are experiencing any technical difficulties whatsoever, feel free to let us know actually on the right-hand side in the chat feature that you'll see right there. Or you can always send us an email to conference@thenextweb.com. Again, that's conference@thenextweb.com. And we will be in touch with you shortly after that. So that's great. And then the second thing I just want to mention to you all is if you have any comment to make about the presentation whatsoever or the session, if you would like to respond to another participant, etc., you can do all that again in the chat feature on the right-hand side of the session. And if you have any specific questions for any of these three speakers, Andrew, Brendan, and Varun, if you could just, before you actually type your question, if you could write the letters @Q&A after that, again, that's the @Q&A, and then ask your question. That really helps us big time, because when we sift through this chat afterwards, when it comes time to answer the questions, we can easily pick out the questions that were directed towards the speakers, right? So without further ado, I'll stop talking now and let you all enjoy the content. Let's see, I just want to get all three speakers on board. If you guys want to turn on your screens for me. Cool, we got Brendan there, excellent. Just waiting for Andrew. Yep, there he is. And Varun, excellent. How are we all doing today?
Excellent, thank you, Samuel.
Wonderful, well, it's great to have you all here. So everyone who is tuning in, we have here Brendan, who's the Vice President of EMEA at Rangle, Varun, who is the Director of UI Architecture at Rangle, and Andrew, who is the Director of Digital Innovation at Rangle. And during the session, they're going to be looking at transformations within the front-end ecosystem and specifically focusing on the tools and techniques that make up the building blocks of this. All right, guys, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Samuel, and thank you everyone for joining. My name is Brendan. I represent Rangle in Europe, here from our office in Amsterdam. And while we would all prefer to be at the traditional Next Web conference that's hosted here in the city, I want to say thank you to the organizers for doing a really nice job putting this virtual session together. The networking function has been really great, and we're meeting all sorts of wonderful people. This talk on the future of front end is really special to me and my colleagues at Rangle. We founded our company in 2013 in response to changes in the web, with logic and experience moving into the browser. And we made a big bet on modern JavaScript. We partnered early with the Angular core team, and then React, and then Vue, and designed, architected, and built hundreds of applications with organizations around the world. And during that time, we've developed a set of best practices or table stakes, sort of the minimum things you need for a great web experience. And this talk is going to share those with you. But the front end has also not stopped evolving. And here in 2020, there are new techniques and tools that we can use to deliver even better products to our users. And the talk is going to introduce you to some of those newer innovations in the front end space. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to two front-end enthusiasts from the Rangle team, Andrew and Varun.
Thanks, Brandon. So yeah, Varun and I are going to take you through a bunch of different things today, both just kind of what you need in order to really capitalize on your front-end web experiences, but also where those things are going. And you know, we're going to pull out our crystal ball a little bit here, have some fun, and just kind of see where those edges are really moving. But to begin with, you know, my colleague Varun is going to take us through some table stakes and the things that, in order to be able to take advantage of these things, you're really going to need.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so before we jump into sort of the more innovative stuff that's happening in 2020, there's a few of those core building blocks that are really essential to have it in place so that you can start leveraging some of these newer innovations. So the first one is sort of components, and components are one of the most influential changes that have happened in our industry. It's impacted both the way front-end development is organized now, but also the way design is done. For the first time, designers and developers are sort of using the same mental model. In design tools, you break up the UI into little pieces of reusable UI, sometimes called symbol, sometimes called component. And the same thing is happening on the front-end side, where we're breaking up the UI into these small functional or logical components, and then composing them to create more complex UI patterns and the final experience that we ship to the user. And this sort of led into, obviously teams deciding to create component libraries that allowed them to reuse these components across the entire product or even multiple products within an organization. And then that sort of just really nicely evolved into design systems. Design systems initially sort of focused more on the actual componentization and building out the UI from that perspective. But over the last couple of years, design systems has really expanded into becoming the story of how you build products, right? It includes everything from guidelines, principles, tools, code, design assets that really describes how designers and developers collaborate with each other and how your teams actually build products. And it's had some pretty dramatic impact on being able to ship products much faster, more consistently. It reduces the need for handoff between designers and developers because your team is sort of using the same language to speak to each other. And it promotes a lot more collaboration because it brings those different practice areas together. So when we talk about design systems, there are sort of 6 core elements, and that's the way we've sort of thought about design systems at Rangle, and that's how we build design systems at Rangle. And they span everything from areas that are purely focusing on design to development to even organizational change management. So things like design tokens, which really capture the visual characteristics of your product into something that can be shared both in design and in code. A design kit that's used by the users of your design system, the product designers, to be able to prototype and design your experiences. A component library that kind of mirrors that design kit, but in code. And a developer sandbox so that you can build these components in isolation. And we'll talk more about the developer sandbox because that's become an important piece of the front-end workflow. And then also a documentation site, which is the entry point to the design system for your users. It explains not only how to use it, but sort of what considerations went into being able to, when the design system was developed and when users are using the design system. And then lastly, you also do need an operation model that talks about how the design system is going to be maintained and evolves over time, and how others can contribute to the system as it's being used more and more and evolves over time. The next sort of core area that is really important is continuous delivery. It's iterating and learning is really crucial to a product success. That's sort of one of the core requirements to be able to deliver an experience and a product that is successful and solves the user's problem. And in order to be able to go create that iteration loop, it's really important to have a continuous delivery pipeline set up in your workflow. And continuous delivery is not just about technology. It's not just sort of having the deployment pipeline that is so that every time a developer pushes some code, it just sort of triggers and things get shipped out to the user. But it's also about process. It's sort of equal parts process and technology. So it sort of dictates how your teams work. How do you break down the work into small, reusable, small chunks so you can focus on one feature or one subset of a feature at a time, and then empowering your teams to be able to iterate, push it out to the user, run some tests, and get those learnings back into the product development cycle. And then with continuous delivery, the other sort of piece that goes hand in hand is continuous integration, which is sort of the foundation for a strong automated quality practice within your organization. So, it's not just enough to test your product manually. You should be relying on different levels of automation. So even things like unit testing at the code level, or more sort of end-to-end testing for the core user flow, using tools like Cypress or Test Cafe. And then even visual regression testing, now that we're sort of focused more on the component-based model. And what this does is it ensures that new features can be released confidently. It prevents regressions. You catch those regressions really early on within the deployment process. And you can be a lot more confident when you're shipping these features, and multiple teams can be deploying updates to your product without sort of stepping on each other's toes or introducing regressions for some of the other teams that are working on the product. And then with that, I'll pass it on to Andrew to sort of talk about sort of the next phase of things in the front end.
Yeah, so the first thing that we're seeing kind of coming through, and this really does affect anybody no matter what your product type is we're starting to see more experimentation around new ways to organize your products. And what we're really starting to see is a bit of an extension of the kind of emergent architecture concept throughout your whole product, which is kind of this emergent organization, right? Because as you grow, you may have started with, one product team being able to hold the whole thing, but then eventually the product gets more complex. You start to break it down into smaller parts. You get multiple teams, and then you really need to kind of manage how that works. And as we've often seen, the organization chart will often drive the technical architecture in this area. So, if divisions are made, we really need to make sure that they're actually made on customer-centric boundaries and not business-centric boundaries. A customer in e-commerce flow, for instance, doesn't know or care that they're moving from, say, a product detail page team to a checkout team to a shopping cart team, all sorts of things. They just care that they can buy your product. And so the thing that we need to always kind of take a look at is, how can we continue to iterate on this? Because we will get it wrong. As we continue to grow, learn, scale, understand our customers better, we're going to want to make adjustments. And as product people who really intimately know our customers and how they think, how they feel, product folks are actually very well positioned to help realign how our products are composed. And when we get those divisions in the right spot, it really unlocks significant speed, both of kind of your own organizational operation, but also this significant benefit for the customer because you have this end-to-end flow in mind. So with all of these divisions, and as you start to grow, and I'm sure lots of us have run into this problem, you then have the issue of lots of people working on the same product and the same code base. So there's been lots of solutions for that over time. A few of them, as we've gone through, there's been kind of the original, which was iframed apps. Every app gets to run in its own sandbox, which is quite a lovely thing to be able to do. But collaboration started to get really difficult. Composition could get messy pretty quickly. Trying to do anything with kind of shared items, you're really kind of stuck within that sandbox wall. And iframes are useful; they have their place, but they haven't quite gotten to where they need us to be. Then we started to play around, especially in the front end space, with separate apps per route, right? So you might have either subdomains or your /booking or different other sorts of URLs that literally will bootstrap new applications, right? And what this continues to allow us to do is teams can release independently. They're in full control of the browser environment. We don't have to worry about, is team A doing something in the space at the same time that team B is. But the customer experience and the application performance can suffer because as a user, again, they, if they're take that e-commerce flow, they don't care that they're going from a product detail page to a check-in page. And if those are different apps, we have to load different apps every time. So our performance metrics take a significant hit. There's a greater possibility of drift between the products themselves because everybody just kind of, we all naturally optimize for the environment that we're working in. And so that's, it's a useful solution, but sometimes it can bite us in the butt. And then there's also that question, okay, well, if I have multiple apps, how do I share pieces, right? Like, how do I actually get, say, that infamous header that always lives everywhere? How do I get that into all the places? And packages kind of came along mostly in the NPM space to split application into kind of as many pieces as you want, which is, quite powerful, quite flexible, and can provide shared access across teams. But as anybody who's tried to kind of update any of those shared pieces, you get an extreme amount of overhead for any of the changes that you make. You have to check out this code, you have to make sure that runs, you have to then publish a new version, then you gotta get to this one, and it becomes this very large domino effect very quickly. And a lot of the benefits that were there at the beginning kind of disappear because of all of the friction that's introduced. A new thing that people have been talking about a lot is micro front ends, right? And the thought of applications being able to be composed from multiple applications with multiple frameworks on the same page. And this is kind of born, as the name suggests, out of the idea of microservices, which was how we started to deal with things on the back end to bring things into their component pieces. So how can we take a sidebar widget and just reshare that and make that its own team? And while it says we can do it, it's technically possible. Sometimes we have to also have the question of should we? And again, here's where things like application performance can start to suffer. If you're trying to bootstrap Angular, Vue, and React on the same page, that's a significant engineering lift and cost to be able to deal with that. Your maintenance costs can skyrocket because of all of this. And a lot of the needs kind of come from a good place, right? Like organizations want to allow flexibility for their teams. Maybe they want to be able to support multiple frameworks because, as we all know, one size does not necessarily fit all as far as the solution space. You have to look at what your problem is. But what we've found in our kind of playing around with a lot of this is that that's okay to be multi-framework, but don't do it within the same customer experience flow. That's where you're really going to start running into things. So if you have, your normal, again, I'm going to go back to an e-commerce solution, keep that all in one framework. It's going to make your life a lot easier, a lot simpler, truly, and a lot more cost effective in the end. And then, maybe do that admin panel in something different. And, all of these have their pluses and minuses. Technology is often a form of questioning trade-offs. And where we're seeing a lot of these trade-offs kind of come into a beautiful fruition is this thing called federated applications. And this is born out of a feature that is currently in beta that you can play with, but isn't, not quite for prime time, but probably will be within the next couple of months from the people who write Webpack, which is an application builder and module loader. And what it's allowing teams to do is to continue to have that code sharing benefits that packages allow us to have without as much of the process overhead. So, this is going to allow significant flexibility in how our products can be decomposed and also to do it in an incremental fashion, right? So in that iterative pattern, we don't always know exactly where we want to split things up front. We might start building out an application, then we start realizing, oh, hey, this one section is really building and could use for more focused attention. So we can start splitting those things out. It's going to allow us kind of some easier scalability, faster iteration on things. We can compose things at different levels. So we can look at the per route split and split that between pages. We can look at whole sections of applications. We can look at shared smart components. So, if you want that global shared header, you got it. And it can all be done in this evergreen fashion. And one of the areas that we're interested in, not only in the kind of application division space, but is also how does this get applied to the design systems and the component libraries that we were looking at before, which often go through this versioned package system. And for those who are truly far along in their continuous iteration and continuous delivery cycles, and this is why we put those up front, because especially with things like federated applications, if you don't have that quality practice in place, you're going to run yourself into a corner really quickly. And the idea of having this kind of evergreen design system that just rolls itself out automatically, there's some power to that, and we'll see how that kind of works itself into play. But there's some really kind of cool things that we're seeing along this spot as far as being able to split up our applications and truly be able to leverage developer and team thought processes in a different way. So the next thing we're kind of going to look at is a whole bunch of different things that are going to allow us to kind of reduce time to production.
Yeah, so there's definitely been a lot of interesting technological transformations that have reduced the time and effort that it requires to go from an idea to something in the hands of the user. And there are three key areas that are driving this reduction. The first one is workflow enhancements. So new technologies or shifts in technology that have improved our workflow or dramatically changed the way we are designing and building our user experiences. Secondly, headless solutions. So more and more of the complexity is being offloaded to third-party services and to leverage sort of more headless offerings to reduce some of the complexity and focus more on the front end of the user experience side. And then lastly, no-code tools that introduce sort of a new way to build and deploy products. So I'll start with sort of the workflow side of things. So I spoke about components being table stakes previously, and really components have just completely taken over software and the way we build not just front end, but even sort of pieces of state and business logic and the way we interact with the back end too. So there's this thing happened with Ford Motor Company where once they switched to the assembly line, what they found was because they had so much, the way they were building the cars, they could build out sort of individual parts and then assemble them. And they have so much confidence in those individual parts that they didn't need to test the car until the car was fully assembled. And that's kind of the path that we're on with the way we're building front ends now. We can build out these components in isolation with very high confidence that the component is going to work as intended. And when you compose them into that final sort of application or part of a larger feature, you have a lot more confidence that it's going to work as expected in almost the first go. And what that's enabled us to do is build workflows around components where instead of sort of thinking about pages and reasoning about your application in terms of pages, you can start looking at more sort of isolated features and start composing them into different ways and doing experimentation around that. So the first thing we've kind of seen is a trend of building out UI editors, and Storybook is a fantastic example of that. It's become a key part of the workflow for a lot of front-end development teams. And what we're seeing is more and more of the front-end development work is happening in Storybook, where you can focus on pieces of the UI in isolation, but even state management and business logic is now being pulled into this. So we can sort of look at the entire vertical stack that a feature needs. So, connecting to the backend using tools like GraphQL, that can now be managed within Storybook. And what's going to happen is because more and more of the development work is being componentized, and we're really moving to, treating everything as modules that compose together, we're just going to see more and more complex workflows being developed around the component model. The next sort of interesting change that's going to come in is around visual UI editors. So in some aspects, code is perhaps not the most expressive platform. when you're describing visual characteristics, code that can be fairly tedious, and sometimes having a graphical interface just makes your life much easier. So I'll give an example of that. For anyone who's done animation work, describing keyframes in CSS can be done, but it's fairly tedious. Whereas if you switch into an animation tool like After Effects, describing those keyframes on a timeline, it just feels a lot more intuitive. And that's sort of the path we're on with UI development. With components, we're very aware of sort of the constraints and requirements for each component and how things fit together. So there is already work being done to build graphical interfaces on top of those components, on top of code. So you can compose these experiences in a much more intuitive way. And two sort of really great examples of this are modules and block UI. These are obviously sort of very early tools, a lot of them still in sort of private beta or just in beta phase. But what they're allowing you to do is take pieces of your design system or your component library and start using it to assemble pages together or feature sets together. And with modules, it's also sort of going one step further, where you're able to even design your design system, and everything that you do in the application outputs code that is of the highest quality. So this isn't sort of back in the day when we were working with tools like Dreamweaver. This is sort of a more modern way, because we are breaking down the UI into these little pieces. We can be a lot more sure about sort of the quality of code that's going in those components. And then the assembling part is a lot more consistent, because we know what the intrinsic behavior of each of those pieces is. Beyond workflows, sort of the other major shift is around sort of what's the driving force in your development process. So before sort of the single page application revolution happened, a lot of our product development was driven by backend and the constraints that backend had, and that really limited the amount of impact that product strategy or UX had on the product development process. And the reason for that was because quite often a lot of the code lived on the backend. Often teams managed their own infrastructure, often on premises, and it just really slowed down things. So even releasing CSS changes took weeks at a time or months at a time. So companies weren't shipping until maybe not more than sort of once a week or once a quarter. But with that front-end revolution, really what we've seen over the years is more and more of the code is being moved to the front end. And really, front end is what is driving the development process, which is ultimately empowering us to design and deliver better user experiences, because we're not limited by how quickly the backend can move or how quickly we can deploy software. We can deploy software really quickly now, multiple times a day. And we're not limited by sort of the constraints of the backend. And what's enabled that is trends like Jamstack and headless solutions, where on the infrastructure side, there's very few scenarios where you have to manage your own infrastructure. Quite often you're relying on cloud service providers like Amazon or Google. But there's also sort of abstraction layers on top of those cloud providers like Netlify and Versal that are just taking more and more of that complexity away, so that if you want to get a CI/CD pipeline set up for a front-end application, it's almost trivial to get that going, to get your product into the hands of the user quickly and iterate on it really quickly too. And then beyond that, a lot of the other aspects like authentication or content management, those are also moving to more of a headless pattern, where you're only dealing in terms of data. It doesn't control sort of what it doesn't give you UI. It just gives you pure data, and then your front end can choose to display that data in the best way possible for your users. And that's sort of had a really dramatic impact on how quickly we can move, because there's just less backend code to deal with. What little code there is also sort of moving into more of a trend of using cloud native or serverless functions, where you're trying to just not have any stateful backend, so you can scale it up much faster too. So ultimately, it's just really empowering the UX and UI practitioners, and that's true for both designers and developers, where they're not bottlenecked by the rest of the system, and they're the ones who can drive the pace of innovation. And then the last sort of major category here is no code, which is the idea that I talked about the UI, the visual UI development tools, but this is sort of just an extreme version of that, where you're not just working with components, but you are interacting with lower level code and creating the entire experience without having to write any code, or in some cases, just minimal amounts of code. Obviously, this isn't the right answer for everything, but for some things, this is for some specific scenarios, this is just becoming an option that is just essentially is really important to consider. So a Webflow is a really good example of this, and what the no-code movement allows you to do is just it turns everyone into a maker. In resource-constrained environments, it just empowers teams to own the entire experience or deliver things which they wouldn't be otherwise able to deliver. So especially for content-heavy experiences, this has been majorly impactful because quite often marketing teams are understaffed or under-resourced, but they are still responsible for building out company websites. So using tools like no-code, they are able to do that in a much more efficient way and not have to go through developers just to be able to release those experiences. And then in the future, this is just going to have more and more impact on our workflow. And I definitely see sort of development and design tools sort of coming together. And hopefully we would someday get something like Unity for the web, where both designers and developers can jump in and modify aspects of the final experience, either in code or through the graphical interface, without really impacting the quality of code or the final experience. And I think Swift UI is a really great example of this. It's changing the way you build native applications for iOS, and I'm just excited to see more and more of that come to the front-end world too.
Cool. And the last section we've got, we're just kind of, this section is very much more around kind of new shiny and doesn't necessarily play always in the normal day-to-day. But one of the things that we wanted to really highlight is the fact that truly the capabilities of the modern web are more vast than you think, right? We're very familiar with content pages, forms, all the kind of usual things that come out of, say, an unstyled HTML page. But the web has come a really long way. There've been a lot of pioneers and folks who have truly taken their kind of creative abilities and said, why not? And they're building truly immersive experiences and with the widest digital distribution platform on the planet, right? Like the web can't be beat as far as getting things into the hands of your users. It's on every device. Because of the standard-based nature of the web, these experiences can last significantly longer without maintenance than other platforms. Not that I'm suggesting that we set it and forget it, but if you think about, say, a native mobile app, right? You pretty much have to continuously, at least once a year, do upgrades. The development system underneath changes, APIs adjust. You have to, continue to move along. And while that's a useful thing, sometimes there's something just nice for building something that is truly groundbreaking and allowing that work to kind of stand on its own for some time. Because customers value delight and ingenuity, and those things, they take time to think of, right? And think about the last time you encountered a product that wowed you or made you laugh or engaged you in some way, right? Like, these are the sorts of things that I think we should always be striving towards, and it's a whole team game, right? Creativity can come from any side. It doesn't have to be just design. It doesn't have to be just technologists. It's everybody together that kind of allows this kind of beautiful expression of new things. And so there's kind of three main areas that we're seeing the edges really being pushed. First one is in kind of computational power. And what this is starting to unlock is it's creating possibilities that you wouldn't have dared to do before because the performance cost was too great. Right? There's a lot of people that will say, JavaScript single-threaded back. It's fine for moving a few things on the page, but it's not a real programming language. But there's this wonderful thing that's actually been around for quite some time to support all the major browsers called WebAssembly, that can be used across all the browsers. It can be used in hybrid mobile apps. It could be used in node servers. And it's really allowing companies to unlock new experiences. So Figma, which is a new design tool, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically like collaborative Photoshop on the web. Take Sketch and add Google Docs. It's a really fantastic thing that we're seeing significant outgrowth for in the design community. That has a really significant image rendering engine right in the center of the experience. That's all powered by WebAssembly. You got things like AutoCAD, who was able to move an entire CAD software suite online. eBay is looking at small things like barcode scanners. Google Earth is completely flipped around. People have been playing with ports of classic games like Commander Keen, for those who enjoy kind of the old school. There's lots of things that kind of allow us here, and it's it kind of gives us that opportunity where maybe we want to take pieces of code that are written in other languages. C++ is the most common thing that's being ported right now, but it could be others. I know there's a thing called Blazor right now that the .NET community is using that transpiles to WebAssembly. And this is really starting to kind of unlock a lot of possibilities. Again, it's a tool in the toolkit. This does not replace HTML and JavaScript. And we're continuously, playing around with how does this work. But it's kind of a really neat thing to unlock new possibilities. The other thing we're seeing, of course, as most people are in the digital space, is extended reality and all the different ways that it is. And everybody's still experimenting. We're trying to find what are those use cases that really ring. But the key thing is embracing what mobile devices provide, right? We're not, if you've ever even tried to do AR, VR with a laptop, you'll look pretty silly and the hardware's not really going to help you, right? But having that small slab of, magical computer power in your hand allows for so many different things, right? And while most of the adoption right now we're seeing in native platforms, people are starting to transition to the web. So current solutions include, Apple's USDZ files to allow, previews on their devices. WebVR is an older standard. Google AR search, IKEA's product demos are definitely something that people have used. And there's lots of ways when you really need to start melding that flat, I'm on a screen kind of digital experience into the world around us. There's power in that, and there's a lot of exploration there. And WebXR is actually a bleeding edge and kind of still under development standard that is going to allow us to manage input and output to AR and VR capable devices on the web. You can play around with it right now in Chrome and Edge, but it's definitely something if you're in, you need that little extra immersive space. It's it's not just a mobile app thing anymore. We can it's coming to the web as well. And something we've been able to do since actually 2011 is kind of deep 3D rendering of graphics on the web. We've originally been doing it and have been doing it for some time with something called WebGL that allows us kind of these immersive visual experiences, interactive images with depth, so you can kind of take parallax to the next world if you want to take, kind of play with that. Obviously games, but also just some really cool creative, say, transition effects with distortion and other ways that you can move things around, right? Like you can pretend that your card that everybody's got a card component these days. What if your card was fluid? What if it responded to the mess in a different way? This kind of, unlocks these kind of different ways to add, possibly more joy to an application. And again, when, we want to have engaging experiences, even if it's the normal thing that you use every day. And the next kind of step in this evolution is something called Web GPU. And because GPUs have evolved, obviously, since 2011, we're doing a lot more things with it. And what this is going to help us unlock is things like increased scene complexity. So right now you might look at a WebGL thing, you're like, yeah, that feels like old school gamey. It's kind of weird. It feels a little plasticky. But a lot of that has to do with complexity, right? And being able to handle all of that computational power. And there's examples of some of this stuff that we can then add into our applications if we need, is like depth of field simulation on device, color effects, convolutional neural networks, right? That's the thing that has really exploded the machine learning space. So why have that on a server? Why not have that on the device that you've got? And more devices are more than capable of running these things. Physics and fluid simulation, parallel sorting, all sorts of stuff that the GPO can help us with that aren't just graphics. And really, to kind of bring it all up, I kind of challenge you, don't make the same old app. As much as we build them, the world doesn't really need yet another format. We've got a lot of them going. And so I challenge you to find ways to bring your customers value through delight and ingenuity. People love that stuff. When you come across something that really blows your mind, it's really neat. Like, in the WebGL space, I had it on the last slide, but I just ran into this thing that SpaceX had created for their shuttles and for their astronauts to be able to kind of dock on the space station. So if you wanted to, you could do that online. I've done it. It takes a while, but it's definitely worth it. It's fun. And it allows us to kind of push the boundaries of even run-of-the-mill applications that we use every day. And so with that, I know there's been a bunch of really fantastic questions that have been popping through. So Brendan, if you want to kind of pull a couple out, we can, we'll see. We've got a couple of minutes left. We'll see what ones we can address.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go through a couple of these, and then both Andrew and Varun will be at the Rangle booth in the expo area right after this talk to answer the ones that we miss. So first, Christine Welsh, and Christine asked, do you ever use or build reusable modules for creating standardization and flows?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, we totally do. I mean, like, that's kind of the thing, joys of video calls, right? It's your turn. No, your turn. That's definitely something that we're seeing more and more of, right? Like, as a question we get asked all the time, and is a kind of a natural evolution of design systems, is how can I build functionality into this, right? And that brings itself into a bit of a different space of, being able to say, have whole pieces of an experience get packaged up together with all of the logic behind it. Now, we don't generally suggest that you put that in a design system, because the design system is more for a presentational component layer. But that's where things like kind of the federated applications and code distribution patterns start to really come into play.
Fantastic. And we have one here from Sandeep, I think designer, and is asking, how do you bring in the practice of design systems and component libraries into a large organization with big native development teams? So this is something that we see pretty commonly.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a trend where, at least at the grassroots level, people see a lot of value in design systems, and sometimes that value isn't necessarily clear to the executives who might be funding the initiative. So there's obviously a lot of great resources around this. Rangle has a little design systems hub at Rangle.io/DS where we talk about this quite a lot, but there's a lot of research that's gone into it. We have a lot of data around the impact that design systems have. And you can start to have those conversations with your executives and sort of show that the sort of the long-term impact that design systems can have on the company. And the nice thing is you don't have to start with a big bang. You don't need to go out and have a massive design system and get every team to adopt it right away. You can start small, start focusing on one team, get them to create a system and work within that one team, show the impact, and then slowly you can sort of spread out to the rest of the organization as everyone can see the impact that's having and the benefits of the design system. And once that starts rolling, you just get more and more people who will want to use the design system and will be excited and will be reaching out to you.
Wonderful.
Hey guys, just really quickly, actually we're going to extend the session by another 5 minutes just because we have some really great questions going on here and I don't want to rush anybody. So I'll be back in 5 minutes to check in, okay?
Thanks, Samuel.
Yeah, for sure.
Next question. I like this one. We have Alex who wants to jump right to the year 2030 and is wondering if one of you has an idea of, after all of this, what do you see yourself doing in 5 to 10 years in terms of the code that you're going to be writing as front-end developers?
I talked about Unity for the web, and I really hope that's where I'm at, where there's still going to be some front-end code that you have to write, but more and more it's just goes into sort of the game development world, where you might be building an application that is form-based or using some of the elements from WebGPU that Andrew talked about, but it's all happening in the same place, and designers and developers are just using the same tools instead of and working in the medium. That's sort of my long-term goal.
Yeah, and I think we're also seeing, there's some experimentation, obviously, in the machine learning space around, code that writes itself, which is an interesting, brain game to play. I always look at these things as the more low-level stuff that I can get out of the way, but that also, scratches the developer itch. Right? Like, there's a lot of us, very rightly so, that are wary of black boxes because we're not sure exactly what's happening inside, and we're the ones that need to go fix it when the black box, breaks. And the thing that really gives me hope and joy is the fact that all of these platforms are built by other developers with that same mentality and that same skill set, right? So, when we have generated code, because that's often one of the things Varun and I will do, just open up the inspector and we'll take a look and we'll be like, okay, so what's the actual output of this? Like, got the visuals, but okay, I gotta run this, I gotta debug it, what's happening, and we're getting really awesome output as well. So, I always believe in standing on the shoulders of giants and allowing us to then get to those kind of bigger, cooler questions that allow us. I'm never particularly worried about our jobs going away as much as kind of transforming into something kind of more cool.
I like that outlook. We have we need another positive outlook on this one. So we have a question from Josh, and Josh asks, is there a risk that you end up with less innovation as you're setting the constraints with the modules that you've built? And those constraints might be limited resources or frameworks that you can afford.
Yeah, that's a common thing that comes up around design systems is, I'm going to be working within the constraints. Is it going to limit my creativity? The answer is no. Like, creative work really flourishes when you have a little bit of constraints. And the other aspect is sort of getting the resourcing, right? So by leveraging those reusable modules, you open up more time for your teams to dedicate to high-value tasks where they can experiment, they can find new and interesting ways of solving those problems. And once you find those, you implement it, and then more teams can leverage that. So if anything, it does just unlocks the amount of experimentation that you can do by sort of avoiding the duplication of work.
Fantastic. And do either of you have, this is from Kalman, and do you have an opinion on Microsoft Blazor?
I'm going to say no. I don't actually have a solid one right now, but that's something I'm kind of looking to figure out. So, it's actually an open question inside Rangle right now, because we're always doing exploring. We're very much a learning organization, and I think it's really cool to see experimentation and to bring ideas. And as far as Blazor specifically, I'm not sure. It's something I'm very curious about to see how that helps, because again, I do truly believe that there isn't, we have a bunch of tools in the toolbox, and if the right solution for your team is something like Blazor, and it allows you to bring these fantastic experiences, with fast delivery and all the sorts of kind of overall or goals that we're looking for in kind of modern development, then fantastic. But I can't say I've got a deeply informed opinion on it at this point. So I'm curious to know more.
One of the key drivers there is Silverlight coming to end of life, and that's where Blazor is going to be really important, because a lot of software is still written in Silverlight, and for letting those folks transition to more web technologies.
Yeah, and Kalman, if you are available to come by the Rangle booth in the expo, then we'd like to hear how you're using Blazor, and we could have a good discussion around that. I don't see Samuel back, so we're going to have time to squeeze one more in here. We've got another question from Josh that says, is there a gap in terms of things like performance, security, and UX? He's had experiences where marketing has access to update the website, loading large images, insecure iframes, and buttons that are missing the links. How do you see these parts being supported or dealt with?
Yeah, I think the sort of the meta framework trend has been helping with that. So tools like Gatsby and Next.js, where they build more best practices on top of lower level frameworks like React, where image optimization, asset optimization, code splitting, performance, a lot of that is just baked into the framework. So it just adds a lot of gate checks. So you can empower your teams to go in and make those changes, but it will sort of default into best practices. As with any tool, it can be abused, but it's at least starting to introduce those some of those best practices in an automated way, which is really nice to see.
Yeah, I'm also seeing like extensions, because we're all fantastic problem solvers, of looking at, how can we deal with, say, automated checks and reintegrate that into the editor experience. Or, we obviously know and care deeply about a lot of these details, but, not everybody does, and that's okay, because they have other things that they know and care deeply about. So things like image uploads, that's where kind of, simple cloud native processing pipelines can come in quite handy as a system where you can have somebody throw what they got at you, and you can kind of manage it on the other side in a smart way.
Very good. We have a new question from Suraj, and Suraj asked about your thoughts on the future of AI in web design. So, for instance, could apps automatically redesign themselves in response to usage patterns?
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like that's sort of the next phase of design systems, and the component-based model is getting into generative design, where we sort of adopt some of these patterns from the architecture world and apply that to UI design. One project that comes to mind is Project Phoebe, which was a Google experiment in mutative design, where you just take your UI and you define it in terms of sort of what constraints and requirements bring up a feature. And then as the user interacts with it, you see the UI modify to adapt to that user. I think Siri shortcuts is another great example of that, where on the device, the sort of operating system is able to sort of see what the user is doing and make recommendations for shortcuts based on their behavior. So I just feel like more and more of this is just going to come into web design, which is just really excited for that.
Fantastic. We have another one here, which might be another good topic for a discussion at the expo, but have either of you used some of the tools for web AR, and do you have an idea on what are the most promising tools for building web AR?
I think the standard for WebGL on the web has been Three.js. It's just made it approachable to a lot of folks, and they do have really good support for WebVR and WebXR now. So I would say that's a good starting point. But graphics programming is hard, and there's a lot of little optimizations go in, and the WebGL community is flourishing, and there's a lot of options. But in my experience, Three.js tends to be sort of the really good entry point for anyone looking to get started.
Yeah, I know there's also a bunch of people that have been playing with. Correct me for the name, Varun, but React 3 Fiber. Did I get that right?
Yep.
which was more of a component-based version of 3JS. So it kind of fits different, a more kind of component-based mental model, which is also fun to play with.
Yeah, totally.
That's fantastic. And I know we've run 10 minutes over, and really appreciate everyone sticking around and asking some really good questions. We've gotten through all the questions that have been asked here, but Varun, Andrew, and myself will head over to the expo area, and we'll see you at the Rangle booth there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.